And now on Radio National, it's time for a trip to the Jewish Museum of Australia to meet this morning's maker. And today I'm in the Jewish Museum of Australia to talk to today's maker, Lauren Berkowitz, known best for her beautiful installations using plants and other natural materials. And this one, celebrating Jewish New Year and other festivals, is an installation called Salt and Honey.
Well, Salt and Honey is an installation work. It's a contemporary interpretation of the weekly Shabbat get-together and also of the festivals of the Jewish calendar. I've used food and liquid that is richly evocative and symbolic and encapsulates something of Jewish history and memory and life and experience. There's two large tables which are slightly elevated off the ground and they're covered in salt, and laid upon the salt are large glass circular platters, and upon these are different symbolic foods related to the different festivals. Beginning with Rosh Hashanah, which is the Jewish New Year, I've laid this plate with pomegranate seeds and little circular dishes of honey. And at Rosh Hashanah, the Jewish New Year, it's important that bitter and sour tastes are avoided, and there's an emphasis on sweet tastes. A lot of the foods are cooked with honey, and honey, because of its colour, it's golden, that relates to coins and therefore good fortune. So also carrot discs cooked in honey, and these also are meant to represent prosperity and a comfortable livelihood.
So carrots cooked in honey, rounds of carrots would look a bit like coins.
Yeah, and also apple is dipped in honey at this time of the year.
Onto this very lovely platter, which is full of, well, a round of dried fruits and a round of almonds.
And this represents the festival of Sukkot, which is very much based on an agricultural festival where the fruit of the land is collected, put into storage. And a lot of the Jewish festivals are centred around these agricultural seasonal events where certain foods were in season and were gathered and offerings were made to the temple in thanks for God's kind of bounty.
They also, as you say, have other ritualistic meaning and they symbolise other things as well as just being seasonal.
What has happened over time is that a lot of these festivals have been overlaid with historical significance as well. In fact, at the time of Sukkot, people live in flimsy houses outdoors, which is in remembrance of when the children of Israel were nomads, when they wandered through the desert.
So we move on to the next platter.
The Festival of Lights. It celebrates the triumph of religious Jewish freedom over persecution from a Syrian ruler. A popular uprising by Judas Maccabee in 164, and the recapture of the temple and the relighting of the candelabra with a miraculous amount of oil, a very small amount, which apparently lasted for 8 days. So I have 8 little glass jars filled with different coloured olive oils to represent this historical event. Hanukkah coincides with the oil harvest. So again, there's this kind of connection to agricultural events tied into the festivals. And also in biblical times, light was basically derived from these little pots of olive oil. Wicks were floated in little glass jars, and that was their source of light. They didn't have candles.
Oil burners.
Yeah, oil burners.
Talking to Lauren Berkowitz at the Jewish Museum in Melbourne. We're in her exhibition called Honey and Salt, this installation.
I should explain the significance of salt, because that is what kind of binds this exhibition together. Salt is rich in ritual and symbolism. In this particular table, which represents Shabbat, salt represents the sacrifices on the altar. So, in a sense, this table at Shabbat becomes a metaphorical altar. A white tablecloth is laid at Shabbat, which represents purity.
So the one time salt is not used is for the Jewish New Year.
That's the only time it's not used. But also, salt has some negative connotations. In the Bible, if the Jews disobey God, he can wreak havoc on the landscape and turn it into a salt wasteland. And this I find interesting because previous works I've created have used salt in this context. I did something for the Adelaide Festival for an exhibition called Eden and the Apple of Sodom, and the work was made up of weeds, and it was a floor-based piece, and the perimeter of this work was made up of salt, and salt is a really serious environmental problem in Adelaide as it's seeping into the water table. So for me to use salt again in this installation was of great interest because salt has very positive connotations in Judaism.
It does look lovely though, these large rock crystals of salt. It's very beautiful salt. Where did you find that?
It's actually kosher salt, so it's crushed into kind of quite large crystals, but it has quite a beautiful texture and sparkle to it.
It does indeed. It's gleaming away there like diamonds.
Coming back to the Shabbat table, what I have here are foods and liquids which relate to offerings which were made in biblical times at the temple, and they were wheat, wine and oil. The only thing that was not offered was spices. That's a later addition to the Shabbat ceremony. So I have a collection of little Kiddush cups filled with red wine here, and the idea at Shabbat is that you fill your cup till it's overflowing. Then I have a platter covered with small dishes of olive oil. This represents the lighting of the candles at Shabbat, and in some traditions, apparently every woman of the house lights a candle.
I'm talking to Lauren Berkowitz, and she's today's maker. Lauren, how does this particular installation, which celebrates and marks the various foods that are used in Jewish rituals and various Jewish festivals, how does this relate to your other work?
Yeah, I think there are very strong connections with previous work. There's also strong connection with using food, because I think the association with food and smell and taste, all those things are very important in terms of triggering recollection and memory for people. And also, I mean, there's subtle connections to earlier works, such as the olive oil relates to a work I did several years ago at St Patrick's Cathedral, where I filled very tall chemical bottles with varying degrees of yellows and oranges and reds to create a blaze of yellow light on the floor. And that work was very much about the idea of light, and St Patrick's Cathedral is filled with yellow lead light windows. And in Christianity, obviously, light is associated with God, as it is in Judaism as well. So, I mean, these are very subtle connections, but for me it's interesting that they're kind of coming up in the work again. Another connection with olives is, well, the previous work I did, Colourfield at Adelaide University, I used olive leaves as weeds because in South Australia, olive trees are becoming a real nuisance plant and they're invading native bushland and starting to take over, which is interesting because in Judaism, olive trees are known for lasting for generations. They're celebrated for their longevity and
they're very tough.
And they're tough, but in Australia they've become weeds. So again, you know, in the previous work they were used in a negative sense, but here olive oil has a very positive association. Well, olive trees, for example.
So you are combining an aesthetic sense. I mean, you're making artistic judgments about the colours and the textures of all these beautiful foodstuffs with meaning. I mean, obviously they have to mean something or symbolise something as well. So how do you juggle all that when you're making aesthetic choices? For example, with this work, are you a believer? Do you practice all these rituals?
I have to admit that I'm a bit of a lapsed Jew. I actually had to do an enormous amount of study and research for this work because I didn't have a particularly religious upbringing. In fact, it was a very secular upbringing. As with many of my other works, they deal a lot with history and memory, and I always go into a lot of detail and research with whatever I take on. This work has been no different in that sense. I think my interest in this particular installation was triggered by the fact that so many of the festivals were related to the landscape and related to agriculture and ecological issues. So that was the starting point, and then I became really engaged with the materials and the richness of their symbolism and associations.
And that's when the artistic side of you kicks in.
Yeah, I mean, look, as I was saying before, there's a strong painterly connection in all my work. In fact, you know, the works from the last few years, they reference paintings, early modernist abstract paintings, and this work is no different. It very much has a painterly feel in terms of the textures and the colours and the way certain colours are repeated throughout the work. And from afar, you wouldn't actually recognise these materials as food. So there is a strong kind of crossover with art, historical references.
They have the advantage over painting in that you've got the texture, you've got the three-dimensional look, and some of them smell nice too.
Yeah. Well, smell is important with a lot of the work, and the experience of the work is important, particularly going back to the work at the Art Gallery of New South Wales, the Follies, where you actually immersed in plant material, which had quite an overwhelming smell. In fact, some people with hay fever really reacted quite badly to it. And the smell actually went through the whole air conditioning system, and the smell actually changed over the duration of the show.
Well, like all these beautiful foodstuffs, the roses and the pomegranate seeds, figs, and the beetroot-coloured horseradish, those large curtains of peppers and lavender that you made, how do they last? I mean, if a gallery bought, say, the large chili curtain that you made.
Well, it's interesting that you say that, because all the plant material that I chose for the Perspective work, which was called Follies, for example, the chilies were fresh when I constructed it, but by the end of the exhibition they were actually dried, and they would have lasted for a long, long time. I mean, you see dried chili peppers in people's houses as ornamentation and decoration. The other works were made from dried lavender. People stick that in their closets.
Eventually it does disintegrate.
Well, maybe after 10 or 20 years, but they do have a certain kind of lifespan. And also, in terms of making choices for this installation, I had to choose foodstuffs which were going to last at least 6 weeks, and a lot of them are dried foods. Initially, I was quite excited by the idea of using milk, because the Bible abounds with references to, like, the land of milk and honey, but it just wasn't practical unless I kind of simulated milk. But I didn't want to do that. I wanted to use real foodstuffs. And with the eggs, they had to be blown. I couldn't have fresh eggs rotting in here. It would have been a bit smelly. And it's possible that having the food surrounded with salt is acting as a preservative, like it's meant to be. Mm-hmm. So far, the work has been quite resilient. And if this work was to be bought, it would be a matter of replenishing a lot of the foodstuffs over time, topping up the wine, perhaps the oil.
The red wine in those little glasses would have gone off at the end of 6 weeks. So can't really toast you, Lauren Berkowitz. All I can do is wish you Happy New Year. And thanks for talking to me and for being our maker today.
Thank you, Julie.
And Lauren Berkowitz's installation is at the Jewish Museum of Australia in Melbourne till the end of the month.